We're waiting for the congressional delegation in this front row. Thank you all for being here. Many of you I know. My name is Penny Wright. We're really happy to have all of you here, and we're particularly glad to have a return visit from our former Congressman, Tim Bishop, known by, I believe, many of you probably. We were trying to remember whether it's been a year or 2 years. I think it's maybe been 2 years since he paid us a visit, but here he is, and we're happy about that. I'll just tell you a little bit about his career here. Tim Bishop joined the faculty of St. Joseph College of Long Island in 2015 and is currently serving as the director of the Center for Community Solutions at St. Joseph's College. He also serves as a distinguished visiting professor at his alma mater, the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. With degrees in history and public administration, his areas of expertise include federal policy, federal higher education policy, transportation and infrastructure, water quality, and shoreline issues, the federal budget, the Affordable Care Act, the economic collapse of 2008, the American Recovery Act, and the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Bill. From 1973 to 2002, he was employed by Southampton College of LIU in a succession of increasingly responsible positions. For the last 16 years of his tenure, Mr. Bishop held the position of campus provost, serving as chief executive officer of the campus, supervising administrative offices and coordinating academic leadership with the Dean for Academic Affairs. In 2002, he left Southampton College to represent New York's 1st congressional district, one of the few highly competitive seats in the country, in the U.S. House of Representatives. His priorities included job creation, protecting middle-class families and seniors, strengthening education and advocating for veterans, homeland security, fiscal responsibility, as well as safeguarding the environment. In the House, he served on committees to increase the affordability of education for all Americans and was recognized as one of the strongest advocates for college access and affordability. As the ranking of Democrats on the Water Resources and Environmental Subcommittee, he worked to preserve beaches and waterways and was one of the 4 co-authors of the Water Resources and Development Act of 2013. During his time in Congress, Tim Bishop was a leader on national policy initiatives and a champion for local interests. And at St. Joseph's, he is continuing his lifelong commitment to facilitating access to higher education for traditionally underserved communities. In 2015, New York State's Governor Andrew Cuomo nominated Bishop as a director of the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation. In addition, he serves as senior advisor at Envision Strategies, a Washington, D.C.-based government relations firm, and as a member of the board of directors of the Suffolk County Water Authority. He is joined here this evening by his wife, Kathy Bishop, in the second row here, and we're honored to have him. Please welcome Tim Bishop.
Well, good evening to all of you, and Penny, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, and there's a lot of people in this room that work very hard to help me get elected and get re-elected, and so I want to thank you once again for that. It was a real honor for me to have the ability to serve, but I would not have had that ability if so many people hadn't worked so hard to make it happen. So thank you, those of you who were engaged, for doing that. I thought what I'd do tonight is talk a little bit about something that I have been very worried about as a person who comes at issues from the perspective of a former member of the House of Representatives. And then but I'd like to leave an awful lot of time for questions from you so that we have a real exchange. But I guess the thing that I've been worried about is whether or not our system of government, one that is enshrined in the Constitution and one that we all presumably revere, can withstand the stresses of the weaponized tribalism that currently exists in our country. And what I'm most concerned about is whether, again, something that we all revere, supposedly, the checks and balances system built into our Constitution and the co-equality of the branches of government can survive. Because I don't know, it's been stressed over our history many, many times, but I don't know that it has been stressed to the extent that it currently is. There have been activist Congresses that have subpoenaed administrations and presidents. There have been administrations and presidents that have complied with those subpoenas. And there have been administrations and presidents that have contested those subpoenas. But I don't know that we've ever had a circumstance in which we have had such pervasive stonewalling of Congress's legitimate right to conduct oversight. Not just its legitimate right, its constitutionally prescribed obligation to conduct oversight over the executive branch. Nor do I believe have we had a circumstance in which there has been an investigation of alleged presidential misconduct, and that investigation found presidential misconduct, but said that the investigation itself, or the leaders of that investigation, were incapable of carrying the investigation out to its logical conclusion, and went on to say, both in writing and verbally, that the remedy for presidential misconduct is a political one that is prescribed by the Constitution, that is to say, impeachment. Now, I'm not here to argue for impeachment, but what I am here to argue for is the Congress having the ability to conduct an honest and comprehensive assessment of whether impeachment is an appropriate remedy. And so what Congress is asking for isn't or doesn't fall under the heading of presidential harassment. It doesn't fall under the heading of extending the witch hunt or anything like that, in my opinion. What it falls under the heading of is the members of the House of Representatives making a good faith effort to do their job. So if, as the Mueller report says, that there was evidence of wrongdoing, that's what it says, and if the Mueller report goes on to say, which it does, that they did not make a charging decision because the policy of the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice does not allow a sitting president to be indicted. And they also went on to say that fairness dictated that they not charge a sitting president or assert that a sitting president had conducted himself inappropriately without giving that sitting president a forum in which to defend himself. There's only one alternative, and that alternative is the one that's prescribed by the Constitution, which is an investigation and potential removal for office from high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, we can argue about whether or not high crimes and misdemeanors apply here. We can argue about whether or not this is an effort to overthrow a duly elected president, as some are asserting. But what we can argue with is that the imperative that the House be able to have access to documents that allow them to form a judgment. And so that's really all that's going on here. So when the House says, okay, we'd like to see the unredacted Mueller report, okay, fine. Let them look at the raw material. Let them look at the unredacted Mueller report so that they can make an informed judgment. Let them look at the underlying materials that drove the judgments that Mueller and his team made. Because it would be irresponsible for the Congress to go any further than they already have without having access to source documents. I mean, that's just follow basic fundamental principles of fairness. So, but what is now happening, as you all know, is that the House is making requests, in some cases requests that are enshrined in law, like the Ways and Means Committee request for the President's tax returns, which Section 61003 of the IRS Code gives them the unassailable right to have, and says that the IRS shall provide it. Those of you who are lawyers know that shall is the highest order of imperative. So this isn't something that's subject to the jurisdiction or the discretion of the IRS. They simply have to do it. Well, so far, the White House has said that there is no, quote, legitimate legislative purpose for the request, and therefore they don't have to apply. The law says nothing about legislative purpose, nothing at all. We have the chief law enforcement officer of the country, the Attorney General, simply ignoring a subpoena that was approved by a bipartisan majority of the House Intelligence Committee, simply ignoring it. We have the chief law enforcement officer of the country, the Attorney General, instructing one of his subordinates to not appear before a congressional committee. We have the chief law enforcement officer of the country refusing himself to appear. By the way, subpoenas are not discretionary, okay? I mean, I found myself under a federal investigation for 21 months as a result of a very well-executed political hit job. And I was subpoenaed. I didn't have the option of saying, not today. I just can't comply today. I'm not coming. I didn't have that option. A federal marshal would have come and gotten me if I had not complied with the subpoena. So where this goes, it seems to me, is where it is. I mean, where it's headed is redress is being sought through the courts. Thus far, there have been 2 rulings at a lower court, at a federal district court, which upheld the right of the House of Representatives to seek documents. One was in the case of the president's accounting firm, Lazars, and the other was in the case of 2 banks, Deutsche Bank and I think it's Capital One. Now, that will get appealed, or has been appealed, to a federal circuit court, which will issue a ruling. Either party, whichever party is on the wrong side of that ruling, will then appeal that to the Supreme Court. Now, it's very clear that the president is banking on the Supreme Court being in his corner. He has described them as, quote, his judges, close quote. So what we're going to find out is whether the Constitution works, whether we really do have 3 co-equal branches of government, and we're going to find out if the Supreme Court has become just one more instrument in the exercise of partisan power in Washington. And I think how this plays out has a real impact on what kind of country we're going to be in. I don't want to be melodramatic, but for those who think that the president is the victim of a witch hunt, for those who think that this is a renegade Congress that is running roughshod over fairness and principle, at some point they're going to want a Congress that has some authority. They may find themselves with a different president who has a completely different point of view than theirs, and they're going to want to rein in that president. Let us remember how President Obama was characterized by the far right. Remember, he was an emperor, he was a king, he was a monarch, he was a dictator. Remember all of that? Well, he didn't willfully ignore subpoenas. He negotiated, he contested, but ultimately complied. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the case of the subpoena of Eric Holder in the so-called, oh my God, I'm drawing a blank.
Fast and Furious.
Thank you very much, Fast and Furious. So, I mean, you know, we talk about this as a norm-shattering presidency, and in fact, it is. But I think all of that pales in comparison to a presidency that could have the impact of undermining fundamental principles of our democracy. And I think that's what's at stake. And again, I don't want to sound melodramatic, but if in fact the co-equality, the so-called Article I powers of the Congress are found to have no legitimacy in a push comes to shove environment, I think we're going to live to regret that. And if in fact the Supreme Court of the United States continues, you know, to view issues through a partisan lens, I mean, I often remember what John Roberts said when he was having his hearings. He said, you know, we're just umpires. We just call balls and strikes. They have different strike zones. I mean, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. So, you know, I mean, today the House had a set of hearings, or had a hearing on the Mueller report, in which they brought in experts to give testimony. I think they will still try to get Mr. Mueller to come in, and I find it inconceivable that he will ignore a subpoena. I think he's an honorable man, and I think he will not. He will comply with the law, and I think that's important testimony. You know, they're negotiating right now with Barr, who clearly wants to avoid a contempt citation. I think he doesn't have a whole lot of regard for the current Congress, but I don't think anybody wants a contempt citation on their resume. So he's looking to negotiate, and will give you access to some of this material if you promise not to you know, vote a contempt citation. The House is saying they're happy to negotiate, but they're unwilling to do it with preconditions. So that's going to play out. So I do think we're going to get access to more material. The House is going to get access to more material. And I do think that material will help to inform public opinion. But again, I'll say the larger issue is whether our system of government actually works. I'm fearful that it may not. So, I mean, with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions on anything that you want to talk about. I mean, we can talk about this more, or we can talk about any of the things that are going on. Yes, sir?
What about the water situation?
The which situation?
The water situation. I read in the paper occasionally that the water that we're drinking is not good.
You have Suffolk County water?
Pardon me?
So, are you on Suffolk County Water Authority water? Your water's fine. No, I shouldn't kid around. But no, your water's absolutely fine, because the Suffolk County Water Authority has a very rigorous testing regimen that they go through with all of their wells multiple times a year, and they treat for emerging contaminants like PFOA and PFOS and 1,4-dioxane, which is very difficult and expensive to treat for. But if you have a private well, then your system, you should test it, and there may require remediation. I mean, Suffolk County Water Authority just installed 45 miles of water main in Wainscott because of PFOA and PFOS contamination in the area adjacent to East Hampton Airport, because that's one of the things that's included in firefighting foam is PFOA. So the town of East Hampton came to the Water Authority, said, we need your help. They were willing to pay for it, so we did the work. The town of East Hampton paid for it. So water quality is a very serious issue, but I will tell you that that the Suffolk County Water Authority has very rigorous standards, which we test to and adhere to all the time. There's a new standard that's about to be published that is going to be even more stringent than what we currently have. New York State Department of Health will be issuing a standard at some point in the next few months, and that's going to impose an enormous capital cost on water authorities all over the state of New York. But that's the next step. So I think, as I said, just to summarize, if you have Suffolk County Water Authority provided water, you can drink that water with confidence. Yes, sir.
Assuming that Director Bolo gets subpoenaed and shows up, obviously the question that we asked him is absent the Department of Justice letter that says you can't indict the state president. If that were in effect, would you recommend an indictment? What do you think the fallout would be if he says yes?
I think the fallout will be similar to, but more intense than the fallout of his appearance, whatever that was, May 29th or whatever, in which he pretty much said that there was no charging decision because of the OLC ruling, and he absolutely said that if we could have asserted that the president had not committed any wrongdoing, we would have said so. We didn't say so. So I think, you know, we're sort of a visual society, and I mean, what, 1% of the population has read the Mueller report, you know, so when you hear him say that, it has more impact. If you hear him say it before a congressional committee, I think it will have even greater impact. I mean, just look what's happened in the House, where I would guess most members have read the Mueller report. I mean, we've gone from 30-some House Democrats supporting impeachment to almost 60, simply subsequent to the Mueller statement on May 29th. So I think there will be a real impact. And by the way, I think he will say that. I mean, Attorney General Barr can dress it up any way he wants, but that's what the report says. Yeah.
Could we ask people to ask questions using microphones? Because some people couldn't hear that last question. You have to hold it pretty close.
Okay. Yes, I understand that Donald Trump has said that at one point that Saudi Arabia was involved in 9/11. On the basis of my research, I say that was absolutely certain. He later said that Saudi Arabia should have nuclear weapons. And now he's saying he wants to sell nuclear power plants to Saudi Arabia, which has half the oil in the world and really has no need for nuclear power. They don't even have that much industry. What I'm wondering is this his way of getting nuclear bombs to Saudi Arabia, supposedly to fight Iran? But Saudi Arabia could share them with Al-Qaeda. Because that almost happened with Pakistan a few years ago.
I think the whole posture of this administration towards Saudi Arabia is alarming in the extreme. I think, first off, the failure to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for Khashoggi's assassination is simply unforgivable. But now this emergency declaration to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, the sale of which will include access to nuclear technology, in the face of bipartisan congressional action that prohibits that sale. I mean, that's just stunning. Remember how Obama was called a dictator? I'm sorry. But for him to declare an emergency where none exists, use that to circumvent congressional authority, and then engage in behavior that arguably undermines our national security is remarkable to me. Now, Congress is not rolling over and playing dead. There is a bipartisan coalition that is led by Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, and Rand Paul, and from Kentucky, and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. They are introducing, or have introduced, 22 separate resolutions that would block each of the components of the sale. Now, question, will that pass the Senate? Yes. If Mitch McConnell decides to bring it up. Will it pass the Senate? Yes. Will it pass the House? Yes. Will there be 50 Republicans in the House to join with the 237 Dems to override a presidential veto? Hard to say. Will there be 20 Republicans in the Senate to join 47 Dems in the Senate to override a presidential veto? Hard to say. I think there is more of a chance of getting 20 Dems in the Senate, pardon me, 20 Rs in the Senate, than there is getting 50 in the House. But I think you raise a very important point that, and by the way, if we weren't dealing with all the other things that we deal with on a daily basis, that would be real news. And it's not getting a lot of attention. Other?
I don't know how to really do some phraseology here. Part of me says, nothing's simple and easy, nothing's ever black and white. Is some of this from gerrymandering? I'm almost at the point of saying, particularly after the last election here, I really thought this was going to go sweep away if who was in power now. But it didn't happen. I have a house in Florida, it didn't happen. I mean, how, I'm nervous, and I really am quite concerned of what is going on. You know, other than people who should normally stand up and say, this is wrong, instead of staying at that, they say nothing. I hear ministers not complaining because, and I guess, I don't know, are they looking for judges? Is this, I don't know why they're so viral. If I'm wandering, Congressman, I'm sorry. But I'm really nervous of what's going on and trying to find some of the causality. And what's the way of getting out of this?
We've gone from sort of traditional partisanship, which was certainly the case when I entered Congress in 2003, to a bitter, angry partisanship, which I place the inflection point for that as the election of the Tea Party class of 2010, okay? And we've gone from that to now tribalism to now, as I referred to before, weaponized tribalism. And I know you mentioned this briefly. Part of what's at the root of that is gerrymandering and is redistricting, because in Penny's introduction, she said that this is one of the more competitive districts in the country. There are only 50 or 60 that are truly competitive. I mean, unless the incumbent really screws up, you know, like gets indicted. That's never good. Although Duncan Hunter won re-election under indictment. But the fundamental problem is that elected officials are more focused than on any other issue on getting reelected. Okay? And our elections have moved from becoming elections in which we try to influence the middle to where we try to turn out the base. So elections have become base elections as opposed to finding the independents and finding the moderates in the middle. And so what that means is that for most members of Congress, they don't worry at all about the general elections. They worry about primaries, okay? And so if you're a Dem, you worry about being primaried from the left. If you're an R, you worry about being primaried from the right. And what has further happened is that I've been saying for a long, long time, primarily to myself, that the way this is going to change, if it ever does change, is when Republicans in the House and the Senate realize that standing next to President Trump and giving him their embrace imperils their own future. It's not going to change till that happens. But the Trump base, as of right now, overlaps precisely with the base of the vast majority of elected Republicans. So they don't have a political incentive to try to find middle ground. They don't have a political incentive to call out the president. I'm not in Washington anymore, so I'm not having as many conversations as I would have had with fellow members and so on. But I'll bet the gross domestic product that most members are deeply, deeply troubled by how the president is behaving. But if you're on the Republican side of the aisle, you say so at your peril. Look at who has said so. Jeff Flake, forced into retirement. Bob Corker, forced into retirement. Mitt Romney, who's 78 years old and probably isn't going to run for re-election at 84. Or I mean, maybe it's not 78, he's 73 or something. He's old. No, I'm kidding. So, you know, there are no profiles in courage going on here, okay? There's nobody who's willing to say, look, you know, this is wrong. And that's one of the things that I find the most depressing about what's happening is the situational application of principle and the situational application of ethics. And that's what we have. I mean, you know, we impeached a president because he lied about sex. And the leader, one of the leaders of that effort was Lindsey Graham, who is now saying it's no big deal for a president to ignore a subpoena because the subpoena is rooted in trying to find partisan advantage. No, you know, I mean, so I don't know whether I'm answering your question or not, but if we could get to the point, now, and the House has passed a bill, H.R. 1, that would mandate that all states impanel nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And so every 10-year process where there's reapportionment and then redistricting, the reapportionment is math. The redistricting right now in all but about 5 states is a political process. If we could change that so that redistricting was a process that was driven by data and driven by geography, we'd be in much, much better shape. One of the other things we could do is so that we could get away from base elections and this focus on turning out the base is do what Australia does, which is require everybody to vote and fine them if you don't. Because then you wouldn't have to worry about turning out your base. Everybody would come out, and then you'd have to have a platform that appealed, at least reasonably, to everybody. So, now, are either one attainable in this political environment? No. I mean, H.R. 1 has absolutely no chance of even being considered in the Senate. Mitch McConnell simply won't allow that. But that's a potential solution that's available to us that could be part of the healing process. It's not the silver bullet, but it could be part of the healing process. I hope that answers your question.
I'm looking for a solution. Is there a solution to where we
Boy,
are?
I'm a retired member of Congress. I have no solution.
Honesty.
Can Trump be beat?
Oh, absolutely. Let me just answer that before you go. Let me just answer this. Let's just 88,000 votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
I think it was 77,000.
77. I was going to say 88 because it's easy to divide by 2. If 44,000 people voted differently, we would have had a contested election, but it would have gone differently. So I know you're not asking this question, but the frame in which I'm evaluating all of the Democratic candidates for president is which one of them has the best chance of winning back the disaffected Obama voters in in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. It would be nice to have Ohio, it would be nice to have Florida. Who can do that? Because again, my working assumption is that every single vote that Hillary got, whoever the Democratic candidate is, if it's John Delaney, okay, who I'm willing to bet not too many of you know much about, okay, if it's John Delaney, if it's Tulsi Gabbard, if it's Tim Ryan, every one of them will get every single vote that Hillary got. So the key here is who can get back those. So can he be beat? Absolutely he can be beat. But we have to have the right, we Dems have to have the right candidate, and whoever our candidate is has to run a good race, because Donald Trump, say whatever you want about him, is a very skilled politician. He's very skilled at identifying vulnerabilities and anxieties and fears in the electorate, and then speaking in a way that is very powerful to those fears and anxiety. That's how he won in 2016, and if he wins in 2020, it will be because he was able to do the same thing. I hope that answers your question.
Before we move to the next question, could you just talk a little bit about the candidates and their abilities or potential or
Thanks a lot.
lack thereof?
No, actually, no, I can't. No, I mean, look, again, my frame is who can win back those disaffected Obama voters. There's a wonderful book that I would encourage all of you to read called The Great Revolt. It's written by a woman named Selena Zito, who is a conservative columnist, but it is a book that is rooted in thousands and thousands and thousands of interviews that she conducted with Trump voters in the states that I've mentioned, plus Iowa. And it is unbelievably revealing on what compelled people to switch from Obama to Trump. And I think it's required reading for anyone who wants to see a Democratic candidate elected president. So
What were some of those points that you made?
a couple that come out. One was right or wrong, honestly or less so, President Trump presented an image of strength, and that contrasted perfectly with an image of President Obama as being weak and feckless and, remember, leading from behind. Remember how often we heard that? But that was the popular perception of the president. Now, what President Obama was trying to do, I think, was move away from the bellicosity, if that's the right word, of the Bush presidency. And so, in some ways, President Obama was a reaction to the presidency of George Bush, and in some ways, President Trump is a reaction to the presidency of President Obama. So there's that. There is that he cares about us. He's going to take care of us. He listens to us. No one else listens to us. He presented himself as an outsider. And again, I'm not commenting on the accuracy of any of this. I'm commenting on how he was perceived. He presented himself as an outsider that was not going to be, afflicted by, the evils that occupy the territory inside the Beltway. Remember, he was going to drain the swamp, So all of that resonated with people who, who had felt aggrieved by what either the government had done to them or hadn't done for them. And then I think the other issue that was overwhelmingly powerful, and that's why we hear about it so much, was his emphasis on undocumented immigration. So those, and by the way, there's more. I'm just sort of giving you the highlights. I'm sorry.
Well, we got,
Yeah, this right here.
I forgot my question, it took so long. We talked about subpoenas. Someone like Hope Hicks, who is a private citizen, why don't they go after her now? And you just said before that they would have come to your door and taken you away. Why don't they do that with the private citizens who are refusing to answer the subpoena?
I'm not going to comment on whether this principle would be legitimately applied, but the principle of executive privilege obtains with Hope Hicks, whereas it didn't with me. You should all be grateful for that, by the way. So I mean, the president can say that, look, she was privy to private conversations and that it would, infringe on the executive branch's ability to conduct its business without undue oversight if someone as close to me as Hope Hicks were compelled to testify. So that's the difference. It's why McGahn. It's why McGahn the president can assert that he can't go to testify or provide documents. The same with McGahn's assistant, Donaldson, is that her name? Or McDonald or something?
no.
What's her name?
Donaldson.
Donaldson, okay.
But Hope Hicks didn't work in the White House every day with Donald Trump. So would they not be able to ask questions?
She was the director of communications for the White House.
Yes.
That is one of the senior level executive branch positions. So it would not be a stretch to apply executive privilege to her. I'm not advocating it or supporting it, I'm just saying it's not a stretch.
Did you,
Is there a path to getting Citizens United decision reversed or alternatively limiting the power of super PACs? That's why there's a path.
I think you could file both under fat chance. I mean, Citizens United would require, well, one path is a constitutional amendment, which requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states. Why I say fat chance. Another path is legislation that would undo Citizens United, which would require 50% plus one in the House, presumably 60 votes in the Senate, and a presidential signature, which would then get challenged. I mean, so that would then go on a path to the Supreme Court in the way that Citizens United was on a path to the Supreme Court. So that's conceivable, unlikely, but conceivable. And reining in the power of super PACs can only be done either, now HR 1, again, which is a very comprehensive election legitimacy piece of legislation. It's got about 8 or 10 pieces to it. One of the pieces of it addresses super PACs. But, like I said, it got 50% plus one in the House. It won't even be considered in the Senate. So we would need a wholesale change of who occupies elected office in Washington before that could realistically be talked about, I think. Not a reason to give up, because my own view as Citizens United is, one of the things that is at the root of how sick our politics have become. But, we just have to try to overcome it other ways. Other questions?
right here.
Don't ask me a question about water, okay? No, I'm kidding.
Hold it close.
No, not at all. We have in our country, we have in our country approximately 50% voting Democrat and 50% voting Republican. And I don't see anything that has happened over the last couple of years to change that situation. I think it's going to be very, very hard to defeat Trump, because the people who favor him still like him no matter what he does. As a matter of fact, I think that they like him more when he does things that he does. So consequently, it's going to be a very tough battle to change that. And I don't know, with all these people running for the Democratic president, if that's going to help anything. The Democratic Party doesn't even know where they are. Are they to the left? Are they to the right? Are they in the middle? Nobody knows.
I can answer that part of it, okay? The
Thank you.
Democratic Party is, without any question, to the left of center. The tension in the Democratic Party is how far to the left of center should it go, and where do its fortunes best lie. I'm going to sort of gently push back. I agree that big picture, 30,000 foot level, 50% of the country votes Democratic, 50% votes Republican. But let's remember, that Secretary Clinton got 3 million more popular votes than President Trump. And let's remember that if those votes had been redistributed in a different fashion, she would be the president. Now,
But they were.
no, I know that, but this is why we have elections. This is why we have campaigns. I'm certainly unwilling to concede that Michigan is going to be Trump country again. Let's look at what happened in Michigan in November of 2018. We elected a Democratic governor. We elected 2 Democratic members of the House who unseated incumbent Republicans. So that tells you something. Look at Wisconsin. We elected a Democratic governor. We unseated, I think, 1 Republican member of the House by a Democratic challenger. So that tells you that the political leanings of those states are not cast in stone. It tells you that the right candidate and the times can change how people align themselves. Because let's also remember, roughly 35% of the country consider themselves to be conservative. Roughly 25% of the country consider themselves to be liberal, and roughly 35% of the country, this is now self-definition, consider themselves to be moderates. So that's 95% of the country. So even though I said before that elections have become base elections, and even though our turnout is nowhere near as ideal as it could be, people are not locked in. I mean, Dems may be locked in, Republicans may be locked in, but, 40% of the country isn't necessarily locked in. Go ahead.
But thank you. But where are the people, the Democratic voters going to go when the country goes further to the left? I mean, there are a lot of people that are against that. If they go to the left, they're going to drive people to the Republican Party. That's my feeling. I may be wrong,
And that is,
but that's my feeling.
that is a legitimate concern. Well, what I think is a more legitimate concern is if the Democratic Party goes too far to the left, or I don't know how this is possible, but if the Republican Party goes too far to the right, I mean, I think they're already there, then people stay home. So rather than vote for someone whose positions they can't endorse, they simply stay home. That might be one of the reasons that turnout is as abysmal as it is. But there's no question that there's a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party, and there's no question that this new class of freshmen is driving part of that, although the vast majority of the new freshmen that were elected are Democratic freshmen, are moderates who beat incumbent Republicans in swing districts. So we can all name Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? And we can all name Rashida Tlaib, and we can all name Ilhan Omar, and maybe Alyssa Presley. Can you name any of the other 37 new members of the House? Maybe not. So they get the attention because what they say is newsworthy. But the vast majority of the new members that were elected are pretty traditional, left of center people that would not be described, at least recently, as the way Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez self-describes as a Democratic socialist.
I hope you're right.
I haven't been right on anything since Trump rode the escalator down into the lobby of Trump Tower, okay? So don't trust me. Did I see? Yes.
All right, so there's one more question. You said H.R. 1 has passed the House.
Yes.
Now, how long can it sit there passed, even if does it die at the end of the congressional term for this group?
Yes. We are in what's called the 116th Congress.
So you have to start
And each
over.
Congress is a 2-year
Right.
affair. So at the end of the 116th Congress, which will be January 2nd, 2021, on January 3rd, 2021, we begin the 117th Congress. And so anything that was passed in the 116th in either chamber that was not acted upon either dies or it has to get reintroduced.
Right, and that's the standard practice that has
Yep.
been followed.
Yep.
So a lot of the bills the Republicans tried to get through and the Democrats tried to get through over time are just dead and probably are going to have a very difficult time to be revived unless you have a real change in both houses.
Things like H.R. 1 will not pass the Senate. I'm willing to bet will not pass the Senate until one of two things happen. Either we have 60 Dems, unlikely in the near future, highly unlikely in the near future, or the Dems do what the R's did with respect to the 60-vote threshold on judicial appointments and invoke the so-called nuclear option on legislation, which is something that thus far no one wants to go near. But because then you could pass something with 51 votes. Yeah.
We have someone in the back and then this gentleman.
It's a tough fight.
It is.
Mr. Bishop, you think Mitt Romney is old at 73. You must think I'm ancient because I'm 78. This is purely to introduce the question that I want to ask. We're concerned about short-term issues of who wins this election here, who doesn't. There is one significant issue facing this planet which I will not be around to see, and that is climate change, which makes every other consideration moot. Do you have any views on climate change?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's an existential crisis that we are facing, and it has the intensity of the crisis has been exacerbated by the environmental policies of the Trump administration in a way that, again, is unconscionable, in my opinion, and anti-intellectual, and constitutes denial of science that virtually the entire scientific community embraces. Now, we have one candidate for president whose signature issue is climate change. Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington State, and I'm biased because he was one of my closest friends when I was in Washington, and he's a fabulous guy. He'd be a fabulous president, in my opinion. I think his name recognition is around 3%. You know, I mean, so it's going to be hard for a Jay Inslee to emerge from a 23-person field. I mean, he'll be lucky if he makes the second debate, you know, or the third debate, where the measures to get on the debate stage, you know, become more strict. So look, it's a huge issue, and the Democrats are the only ones talking about it. And I know that this sounds very partisan, but I'm not going to apologize for it. When I was in Congress, we had an amendment. We had some bill that we were considering. I don't even remember what the bill was. But a Democrat offered an amendment that simply said, do you accept the science of global climate change and global warming? You vote yes if you accept the science, you vote no if you don't accept the science. Now remember, the Dems were in the minority. The noes won that vote, okay? So I think all but 3 or 4 Republicans simply voted that they did not accept the science. So this ought not to be a partisan issue, but it is a partisan issue, and it ought to be one of the issues central to the presidential campaign, but I don't know that it will be. It depends on who the candidate is. And it also depends on what the Democratic candidate offers as a policy prescription. I have not read the Green New Deal, okay? But I will say that its rollout was unfortunate, to say the least. And so whether or not what's in the Green New Deal was amenable to honest debate got lost in how poorly done the rollout was. But that's the kind of thing. I mean, we need, call it what you want, the New Deal, a Marshall Plan for climate, whatever it is. We need that, and we are all remiss if we don't insist on that.
Yeah, but the Democratic Party will not even put the climate issue on the debate floor.
That's not entirely accurate. What the Democratic Party, or let's put it this way, what the leadership of the House won't do is put the Green New Deal on the debate floor. Why? Because it will go down to a resounding defeat. So there's no point in doing that. It's sort of like, you know, Barr coming out and saying that there was no collusion and no obstruction, and that sets the agenda because nobody else goes much beyond that, right?
Yeah.
If all you know about the Green New Deal is that 380 members voted against it, you're not going to spend much time thinking about it or assessing it or anything. So we Dems have put some climate-related things on the floor, and they've passed. But the Green New Deal, I think, my own view is, I think Speaker Pelosi has been, has shown some real political acuity by not putting it on the floor.
Yeah, but Inslee, okay.
Relevant to the same subject, there is one piece of legislation in the House, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is a carbon fee and dividend proposal, which has the support of, I think, like 30 Republicans. I shouldn't say it quite this way. The legislation only has one Republican sponsor and something like 40 Democratic sponsors.
And it would impose a carbon tax, is that what you said?
What it does is it imposes a carbon tax, they call it a fee, political reasons, but all the money comes back to the people in equal amounts per capita. So if you spend a lot of money on a gas guzzler, you'll pay more in tax. If you don't own a car, you'll get more money back than you actually spend. And what it amounts to is it's a progressive carbon fee and dividend. So the bottom 40% of the earning public actually get more money back than they spend. So this has received support from, I forget the number, 30 or 40 people in the Climate Solutions Caucus, equal Democrats and Republicans. But it'll never pass the Senate, in the current Senate anyway. But it has been introduced 2 years running now.
I'm going to have to learn more about that, but listening to your description of it, it addresses one of the principal objections to the bill that we passed when I was in the House in '09, the cap and trade bill. The concern was that lower income people would be disproportionately impacted, and it was, in effect, a stealth tax on lower income people. And what you're suggesting is that that problem would be remedied by this bill. So I think that merits consideration.
HR 763.
You know who the principal sponsor is?
I wish I remembered. I'll send you an email.
Jay Inslee, by the way, was the founder of the Climate Change Caucus when he was in Congress, and I was a member of it.
And we haven't even talked about immigration.
You're right. We can, but Penny, what?
Well, it's up to you. We usually like to keep these things to an hour, but if people want to go on a little bit, like take a couple more minutes.
I go on double time and a half at 6:30.
So, but has anybody who has not asked a question, has a question to ask, let's just do that first. We'll just keep a few more minutes here.
Recently, it's come forward the question of, for the upcoming census, including a question about citizenship, and in a community like ours where that question would have a large impact, I was wondering what your thoughts as someone who served this area thought about that question.
I think the question ought not to be included. I think the explanations that have been given for why it is included so as to facilitate enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, really, I think those are fanciful, and I think the documents that just came to light from North Carolina suggest that there is a real political motivation for asking that question. The political motivation being sort of solidifying a Republican majority in the House, and also seeing to it that traditional blue areas get less in the way of government funding that is provided on a formula basis that's rooted in population. So I think the effort is baldly political, and I think will have a very detrimental impact on certain areas like this one. And I'm very hopeful that the Supreme Court, this will be, I think, probably the first test of whether the Supreme Court is going to be just one more way to exercise or to achieve partisan advantage, or whether there really are going to be people that will look at facts and make a judgment. That ruling is probably going to be made in the next couple of weeks, so we'll see. But supposedly it would result, I've seen numbers that it would result in an undercount of people to the tune of somewhere between 6 and 7 million people, and that can have a lot to do with both reapportionment and redistricting, and that can have a lot to do with how the House is comprised. So, very serious issue.
We didn't even talk about the Supreme Court. It's kind of scary to think about long term, but
I'll just say one thing that is probably rooted more in optimism than anything else. I have some hope that John Roberts will become the Justice Kennedy of this court, because I do think that he is an institutionalist who wants to see the court respected as a nonpartisan arbiter of the law. Whether that happens or not, I don't know.
Should we do one more?
One more
Was it
question.
you? Yeah, okay.
Mitch McConnell.
Close personal friend.
What is the source of his power that he can say, we're not considering this legislation passed by the House?
The majority leader in the Senate has almost unfettered authority to determine what comes to the floor and what doesn't. And he is what the real answer to your question is, the real source of his power is that he presides over a conference that is simply unwilling to challenge. And so if there was a piece of legislation that, let's say, 45 of the 53 Republicans wanted to consider, they could force that, but they're unwilling to challenge it. And part of that is the traditional deference afforded the majority leader, and part of it is inertia, and part of it is fear for how he would respond, I think. But look, in fairness, Harry Reid, you know, if you talk to a Republican senator in 2011, they would have described Harry Reid as the Antichrist. You know, I mean, they thought that he was every bit as obstructionist and every bit as unreasonable and every bit as dictatorial as you and I might think that Mitch McConnell is.
You said almost unfettered that.
Almost unfair, yes.
Yes. Is there anything other than if like 45 and?
Well, no, that's why we would take his membership to stand up and say, sorry, Mitch, but we're making the call on this one. That's what would be required.
okay.
Thank you all.
I think thank you very much for coming back. We're glad you haven't forgotten us. We have not forgotten you. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you next year, same time, same place.